Chapter 3. Seldom Seen. I froze. I mean, wouldn't you? What is it? I asked, trying to speak without moving my jaw. What did I do? I sounded like a bad ventriloquist, but I didn't want to give Gracker any excuse to fire that ray gun. You tried to throw me to the ground, he said, sounding offended. Fortunately, the trained reflexes of a Friscan fighter are more than a match for such an obvious move. I started to ask what he meant, then realized my mistake. I suppose it should have been obvious. Never shrug while carrying a trigger-happy, paranoid alien on your shoulder. Maybe they should add that to those survival rules your parents teach you when you're little. Now remember, Rod, don't eat soap, look both ways before you cross the street, and never annoy a temperamental alien. Can I talk? I asked in my bad ventriloquist voice. Softly. I wasn't trying to throw you off. I was shrugging. It's something we Earthlings do. Do you expect me to believe that? Why don't you ask Madame Pong? I said. Isn't she supposed to know that kind of thing? Gracker thought for a second, then said, All right, we'll ask Madame Pong, but move slowly. Look, I said as I walked slowly back to the room. I'm not your enemy. I don't like the way you're treating me, but I'm not out to get you or anything. Just return to the room, said Gracker. I hoped when we got back to the room we wouldn't find the things playing catch with the spaceship. If we did, I figured I could kiss my brain goodbye. Fortunately, Madame Pong had the situation well under control. The twins were sitting side by side, staring at her with fascination as she told them something I took to be a fairy tale from her planet. I expected Gracker to interrupt. To my surprise, he told me to be silent until she was done. Before I could figure out what was actually happening in the story, Madame Pong said, And that is how the Snavel and the Wonkus came to live happily ever after. Then she made one of her tiny bows. The things began to clap. Tell it again, they demanded Thing 1. I'm sorry, said Madame Pong, but like the Wonkus, I have work to do. Are you ready? She asked, turning to Gracker and me. I started to nod, but thought better of it. Yes, I said. Did you know that if you have your lips apart, you can say yes without moving anything except your throat? We left through the back door. I had Madame Pom in my front pocket, the starship under my arm, and the things and Bonehead bouncing along behind me. Gracker was still on my shoulder, pointing the ray gun at my head, despite the fact that I had assured him at least 3 times that I didn't have any intention of harming the ship. I am responsible for the safety of the Furkle, he had replied each time. Without meaning offence to you, I must do my job. After the 3rd time I'd started to shrug, but managed to stop myself. Once we were outside, it took a few minutes to decide where to go. After all, when the ship expanded to full size, it was not going to be easy to hide. Fortunately, I had a lot of places to choose from. The land where my parents had built our house used to be part of Grandpa's farm. The house sits on a hill that slopes down to a swamp. On the far side of the swamp lies a big field surrounded by woods. Grandpa calls the field Seldom Seen. He gave it this name because the only way you can get to it is by going across the swamp, which you can only do on foot, or by making your way over half a mile of bumpy dirt road that cuts through a neighbour's automobile junkyard. Seldom Seen is the only part of our land Grandpa still uses. Every spring he plants it with oats or corn. About the only people who go back there are my family, a few hired hands, and in the fall, some hunters. I love Seldom Seen and the woods that surround it, but I think the swamp is my favourite place because it's so odd, even spooky, with its murky pools and huge old willow trees. To cross the swamp, you start on this chunk of land that's usually dry, though it gets pretty squishy in the spring and fall, sometimes actually ending up completely underwater. Then you use this weird little bridge my father and some of his friends built back when Dad was still around. The bridge is about 6 feet wide and 20 feet long. It has no side rails and is only about 3 feet above the water. Beneath it flows a stream, the only running water in the swamp. The bridge is a great place for lying on your belly and watching what swims underneath, which is mostly nothing, though sometimes in the spring there will be a big fish. "A froggy!" cried Little Thing 1 as we started across the swamp. She loved frogs, and having spotted one, there was no way she was not going to chase it. "Stop her, Bonehead!" I cried, suddenly glad I had let him tag along. After all, I didn't dare chase Linda myself. Any sudden move might make Gracka trigger happy. But if she got herself wet, I'd be in big trouble with my mother. Bonehead got her back into the group without much fuss. "I like this," said Gracka as we stepped onto the bridge. "It looks like home." "Do you come from a swamp planet?" I asked, thinking of some of the old movies I'd seen. "Do you come from a swamp planet?" he replied. I started to ask what he meant, but then figured it out on my own. A planet is a big place, and it's pretty silly to think it'll all be the same from one pole to another. That should have been obvious to me, since in this little walk we were going from lawn to swamp to field and possibly to forest. "I do not come from a swamp planet," said Gracka when I didn't answer, "but on my planet I used to live in a swamp." His voice was wistful, as if he was really missing his swamp. "It was a lovely place," he continued. "Boggy and smelly." "How nice," I said. "Don't get all soppy, Gracka," called Madame Pong from my pocket. "We have work to do." I realised to my surprise that Gracka was sniffing. "See any place big enough for the ship yet?" I asked, hauling Little Thing 2 away from the edge of the bridge. "Not yet," said Gracka. "Keep going." "So how is it that you two speak my language?" I asked. "Did they give you a crash course before you left?" I realised after I said it, I was under the circumstances. Crash course was a bad choice of words. "We have monitored your broadcast material for several decades now," said Madame Pong. "That material is run through a computer which analyses your language. That analysis is used to prepare a language module which we plug into a unit that has been surgically implanted in our brains. This module provides, within certain limitations, instant translations. If I take it out," and here she reached up and pulled something from behind her ear. "Eep, eep," she said, finishing the sentence with a couple of squeaks. She replaced the module and said, "Simple, really." "Elementary," I replied. "I recognise that," said Madame Pong. "You're quoting Sherlock Holmes. I like Sherlock Holmes." "How do you know about him?" I asked. "I told you, we've been monitoring your broadcasts." "So, what do you think of what you've seen?" I asked, wondering if they had picked up things like Gilligan's Island and laxative commercials. "You are a very troubled people," replied Madame Pong seriously. "We feel bad for you." Before I could figure out what, if anything, to say to this, Gracka shouted, as loud as he could, considering he was only 2 inches high, "There! That's the spot!" We had left the swamp path and crossed the edge of Seldom Seen. Grandpa had been ploughing last week, so what we saw as we came out from between the scrub trees was 8 acres of soft brown soil, surrounded on all sides by low-growing forest. Lots of room, no one to see it. It was indeed perfect for the alien's purpose. "Walk on a bit," said Gracka. "We need to set the ship farther from the trees before we enlarge it." "I want to carry the spaceship, Roddy," said Thing 2. "No, I want to carry it," whined Thing 1, who clearly had not had a bit of interest in carrying it until just this moment. "I have to carry it," I said firmly before Gracka could jump into the battle. "And that's that." "Strange species," said Gracka, "letting such undeveloped creatures walk around on their own." "They're fun," I said, defending the twins in spite of myself. "Strange species," repeated Gracka. "Put the ship down here, please." Following his directions, I placed the ship carefully on the ground. "Now what?" I whispered. "Now we blow it up," said Gracka. causing me to wonder if their language implants were as effective as they thought. "Move back." I took the twins by the hands and walked back until Graka said we were safe. After a moment, a blue crackling light surrounded the ship. "Wowie!" cried Eric as the ship began to grow. It doubled in size, then doubled again until it was nearly 10 feet across. Suddenly, the crackling light began to fizz. We heard a series of loud bangs, like a string of firecrackers going off, followed by a whining sound as the ship shrank back to its 2-foot size. "Buggers," said Graka, which made me wonder again about his language module. "Should we go over to it?" I asked nervously. "Not yet," he said. "Let me talk to the people inside." I was about to ask how he was going to do that when I realised he probably had some sort of radio equipment. I also wondered just how many aliens there were inside the ship. 2? A dozen? 100? This was starting to feel like a genuine invasion. He pressed a button on his collar and began to mutter. After a while he stopped and bent his head as if listening. Mutter, mutter. Listen, listen. Finally he pressed the button again, then turned to me and said, "We'll have to go back to your room. Something is wrong with the enlarging device, and we have to repair it. It looks as if we're going to be your guests for a while." "What Graka means," said Madame Pong, "is we would appreciate it if you would extend us your hospitality until we are able to repair our ship."
"What I mean," said Graka, "is that he takes us back to the house and finds a safe place for us, or I arrest him for obstructing interplanetary justice."